The first ships appeared on a Tuesday morning, hanging in Earth's sky like black tears against the blue canvas of atmosphere. Captain Sarah Chen watched from the observation deck of Luna Station as the massive vessels settled into geosynchronous orbit, their hulls reflecting no light, absorbing everything like wounds in space itself. 18 confirmed contacts, reported Lieutenant Torres, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Each one measures approximately 3 kilometers in length. No response to our communication attempts. Sarah's knuckles whitened as she gripped the rail. 23 years in the United Earth Navy, and nothing had prepared her for this moment. Humanity had always wondered if they were alone in the universe. Now they had their answer, and it terrified her. The waiting lasted exactly 72 hours. When the transmission finally came, it bypassed every communication protocol humanity had ever devised. The signal appeared simultaneously on every screen, every device, every surface capable of displaying an image across the entire solar system. The face that materialized was humanoid but wrong, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that held no warmth, only cold calculation. Primitive species of the third planet, the being spoke in perfect English, though its mouth barely moved. I am Overlord Thane of the Hegemony Collective. Your development has reached the threshold where your continued independence poses a threat to galactic order. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Behind the alien's words lay an assumption so casual, so absolute, that it struck her like a physical blow. You will surrender all weapons. You will dismantle your space-based infrastructure. You will submit to hegemony oversight and accept your designated role as a servitor species. You have 72 of your planetary rotations to comply. The transmission cut to black, leaving humanity staring at their own reflections in dead screens. The next 3 days blurred together in a chaos of emergency sessions, desperate planning, and growing desperation. World leaders gathered in Geneva while military commanders tried to assess their options. The conclusion was always the same: humanity's most advanced warships were barely more than toys compared to the alien vessels. We have to consider surrender, President Martinez said during one heated session, his face haggard with exhaustion. These beings have technology centuries beyond ours. Resistance would be suicide. General Harrison slammed his fist on the conference table. Surrender? Did you see what they called us? Servitor species. They're talking about slavery, not coexistence. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the head of Earth's Xenobiology department, leaned forward. I've been analyzing the transmission data. The linguistic patterns, the casual dismissal of our autonomy. This isn't their first conquest. They've done this before, many times. To them, we're just another primitive species to be catalogued and controlled. The debate raged on, but Sarah Chen wasn't listening anymore. She stood at the window of the Geneva Command Center, staring up at the alien ships that hung over Earth like executioners' axes. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, stories passed down from the old woman's own grandmother about the Japanese occupation of her homeland. Sometimes, Sarah, the old woman had said, the only choice that matters is how you choose to die. On your knees or on your feet. The official response came on the final day of the ultimatum. President Martinez, flanked by world leaders, appeared on every broadcast network. His words were measured, diplomatic, designed to buy time and preserve lives. To the representatives of the Hegemony Collective, humanity acknowledges your technological superiority and wishes to negotiate terms that preserve the dignity and rights of our species while addressing your concerns about galactic stability. It was surrender dressed in diplomatic language, and everyone knew it. The alien response came within an hour. Overlord Thane appeared on screens worldwide, his obsidian face showing what might have been amusement. Negotiation implies equals. You are not our equals. Compliance officers will arrive shortly to begin the transition process. Resistance will be met with pacification. That's when the first ships descended. They came down like falling stars, massive transport vessels that landed in major population centers across the globe. New York, London, Tokyo, Moscow, Delhi, Sao Paulo. The ships disgorged beings that looked like Overlord Thane but smaller, accompanied by floating metal constructs that hummed with barely contained energy. The beings called themselves compliance officers, and they began their work with ruthless efficiency. Weapons were confiscated. military installations were occupied. Government officials were replaced with human collaborators who spoke the hegemony's words with dead eyes and broken spirits. But the hegemony had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that humanity's government spoke for all of humanity. Sarah Chan resigned her commission the day the first compliance officer set foot in Luna Station. She watched as they systematically dismantled humanity's proud achievements, reducing decades of technological advancement to scrap metal. The officer in charge, a being who called itself Administrator Vex, approached her as she packed her belongings. "Your emotional distress is noted but irrelevant," Vex said in that same flat, mechanical tone. "You will be reassigned to agricultural duties on the planet's surface. Your military knowledge has no place in the new order." Sarah looked up from her packing. "What new order? Slavery?" "Optimization," Vex corrected. "Each species serves according to its capabilities. Humans show aptitude for manual labor and basic manufacturing. You will be content in your assigned role. And if we're not?" Vex's obsidian eyes showed no emotion. Contentment is not optional. That night, Sarah sent out a message on the old military emergency frequencies, channels the hegemony hadn't yet discovered. The message was simple: coordinates to an abandoned mining facility in the asteroid belt, and a single word: resistance. She wasn't the only one who refused to accept humanity's fate. Commander Marcus Reed had served 20 years in the Earth Defense Force before the surrender. He'd fought pirates in the outer system, rescued stranded colonists, and maintained the peace that had allowed humanity to flourish among the stars. The day the compliance officers arrived at Mars Station, he gathered his most trusted officers in a sealed compartment deep in the station's hull. "They want us to roll over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid the hegemony's listening devices. "They want us to accept that this is how it ends. That humanity's future is to serve as slaves to these arrogant bastards." Lieutenant Commander Kelly Zhang, his second-in-command, nodded grimly. "The official channels are compromised. Half the brass has already submitted to psychological adjustment. But there are others. Small groups, isolated units that haven't given up." Reed pulled up a holographic display showing the solar system. Red markers indicated known hegemony positions. "They're confident, maybe overconfident. They placed most of their ships in orbit around Earth and Mars, controlling the major population centers. But they can't be everywhere at once." "What are you proposing?" asked Chief Engineer Kowalski, a grizzled veteran who'd helped build half the installations in the outer system. "We disappear," Reed said simply. "We take what we can carry and we vanish into the black. We find others who won't accept this occupation. We build something they can't see coming." The plan was desperate and probably suicidal, but it was better than the alternative. Over the next 2 weeks, small groups of military personnel and civilians began to vanish from their assigned positions. Equipment disappeared from supply depots. Ships developed mysterious mechanical failures that required them to be towed to remote repair facilities, where they never quite made it to their destinations. The hegemony noticed, of course. Administrator Vex increased security protocols and began implementing what they called loyalty assessments. Humans who failed these assessments simply disappeared, their fate a mystery that kept others in line through fear. But, for every person who vanished into the hegemony's detention centers, another slipped away into the darkness between worlds. They gathered in abandoned mining stations, derelict ships, and forgotten outposts scattered throughout the solar system. They brought with them whatever weapons, supplies, and technical knowledge they could salvage. Sarah Chan arrived at Mining Station Delta 7 3 weeks after sending her message. The facility had been abandoned for 5 years, officially decommissioned when the asteroids or deposits were exhausted. But now it hummed with hidden activity as nearly 200 humans worked to transform it into something the hegemony would never expect. "Welcome to the revolution," Reed said as he greeted Sarah at the airlock. The man looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of what they were attempting. "The revolution might be too grand a word for what we're doing." Sarah looked around the bustling compartments where engineers worked alongside Marines, where civilian technicians collaborated with Special Forces operators. "What would you call it then?" Reed's smile held no warmth, only a cold determination that reminded Sarah of her grandmother's stories about the resistance fighters of old Earth. Preparation. The work never stopped. Every day brought new challenges as the growing resistance network tried to stay ahead of hegemony surveillance. They developed new communication protocols using quantum entanglement principles that the aliens apparently hadn't considered. They reverse-engineered hegemony technology from damaged patrol drones, slowly piecing together the principles behind their oppressors' superior capabilities. Dr. James Nakamura, formerly of the Tokyo Institute of Technology, made the first breakthrough. He'd been working with a team of physicists and engineers, analyzing fragments of hegemony energy weapons recovered from various sources. "It's not magic," he announced during one of their weekly briefings. "It's just physics we haven't mastered yet." Their energy manipulation technology is based on quantum field manipulation at a macro scale. It's incredibly advanced, but it follows the same universal laws that govern our own technology. Reed leaned forward. "Can we replicate it?" "Not exactly," Nakamura admitted. "We don't have the manufacturing infrastructure or the materials. But we can adapt it. Human ingenuity has always been about making do with what we have, right?" The first prototype weapon emerged from the fabrication shop 6 weeks later. It was crude, unstable, and had a disturbing tendency to overload and explode. But, when it worked, it could punch through hegemony energy shields like they weren't there. More importantly, it proved that the aliens weren't invincible. Word of the prototype spread through the hidden network of resistance cells that had sprouted throughout the solar system. Morale, which had been hanging by threads, began to strengthen. Humans who had been paralyzed by despair found new purpose in the growing underground movement. The hegemony, meanwhile, had settled into their occupation with the confidence of conquerors who had never faced serious resistance. They established administrative centers in major cities, implemented work quotas for the human population, and began the systematic dismantling of Earth's technological infrastructure. Overlord Thane himself took up residence in what had once been the United Nations building in New York. From there, he oversaw the optimization of human civilization with the same detached efficiency that he might have used to reorganize a warehouse. The transition proceeds within acceptable parameters, he reported to his superiors during one of his regular communications with the hegemony hierarchy. Initial resistance was minimal and has been effectively suppressed. The human population is adapting to their new role with typical servitor species compliance curves. What he didn't report was the growing number of minor incidents plaguing his occupation force. Supply convoys went missing in remote areas. Communication relays suffered mysterious malfunctions. Patrol drones disappeared without explanation, their wreckage found weeks later in places that should have been impossible to reach. Administrator Vex brought these incidents to his attention during a routine briefing. "The pattern suggests coordinated activity rather than random equipment failure," Vex reported. "However, our surveillance networks detect no organized resistance groups." Thane's obsidian features showed irritation. "Then, increase surveillance efficiency. Deploy additional monitoring assets." This species showed no significant military capability during the initial assessment. Any resistance should be easily contained. But, the resistance had learned from humanity's long history of asymmetric warfare. They struck targets of opportunity and vanished before the hegemony could respond. They used the aliens' own overconfidence against them, exploiting blind spots in surveillance networks that assumed human capabilities were limited to what had been observed during the initial invasion. The first major operation came 3 months after the occupation began. Intelligence had identified a hegemony supply depot on Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. The facility was lightly guarded, considered secure due to its remote location and the assumption that humans lacked the capability to mount operations so far from Earth. Saracen led the assault team, 20 volunteers who knew they might not be coming back. They used a modified cargo hauler to approach the facility, its signature masked by debris from Jupiter's ring system. The ship's hold carried the Resistance's entire stockpile of reverse-engineered energy weapons, crude but potentially effective. "Remember," Sarah told her team as they prepared for insertion, "we're not trying to win a war today. We're trying to send a message. We want them to know that humanity isn't going to quietly disappear into their servitor pens." The attack began at 0300 station time. The resistance fighters moved through the facility's corridors like ghosts, their modified weapons making barely a whisper as they disabled hegemony personnel and security systems. The depot's automated defenses, designed to repel conventional attacks, were unprepared for weapons that used their own energy principles against them. Within 2 hours, the facility was secure. The resistance team quickly set charges throughout the complex while downloading everything they could from the facility's data cores. As they prepared to withdraw, Sarah found herself face to face with the depot's commander, a hegemony officer who had been stunned during the initial assault. The alien's obsidian eyes focused on her with something that might have been confusion. "This action serves no logical purpose," it said in that flat, mechanical tone. "Your species lacks the capability to threaten hegemony operations. This facility will be rebuilt. Your people will face retribution." Sarah looked down at the being that represented everything the hegemony stood for: cold, calculating, utterly certain of its own superiority. "You're probably right about the retribution," she said quietly. "But you're wrong about one thing. This isn't about threatening your operations. This is about reminding ourselves who we are." The explosion could be seen from orbit as the facility's power core went critical. The message it sent rippled through both the resistance network and the hegemony command structure. Humanity was still fighting, and they were learning. But the alien officer had been right about the retribution. Overlord Thane's response was swift and brutal. Entire city blocks on Earth were placed under martial law. Thousands of humans were rounded up for loyalty assessments that most would never return from. The crackdown was designed to crush any remaining spirit of resistance through sheer terror. Instead, it had the opposite effect. For every human who disappeared into hegemony detention centers, 10 more found their way to resistance recruiters. The occupation force had shown its true face, stripping away any pretense of benevolent oversight and revealing the iron fist beneath. Reed watched the news feeds from his command center in the asteroid belt, his face grim as reports of the crackdown flowed in. "We've painted a target on every human in the solar system," he said to Sarah, who had returned from the Europa mission with her team intact but shaken by what they'd accomplished. "Maybe," Sarah replied. "But we've also shown them that humans don't break as easily as the hegemony assumed. Look at the recruitment numbers. Look at the intelligence flowing in from new cells forming across Earth. We've given them hope." Reed nodded slowly. "Hope. And now we need to give them something more. We need to show them that this occupation can be ended." The war for humanity's future was about to begin in earnest, and the hegemony was about to learn that they had gravely underestimated the species they sought to enslave. The flames of rebellion had been lit, and they were spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. The war began in earnest 6 months after the occupation started, but not in the way anyone expected. It started with mathematics. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves had spent those months in hiding, moving between resistance-safe houses while continuing her xenobiology research using salvaged equipment. She'd been studying every scrap of hegemony technology the resistance could acquire, searching for weaknesses that human ingenuity might exploit. The breakthrough came when she analyzed biosamples from fallen hegemony personnel. What she discovered changed everything. "They're not individuals," she announced to the emergency council meeting held in a converted ice mine on Ceres. "Not in the way we understand individuality. The hegemony operates on a collective consciousness model, with each individual being essentially a node in a larger network." Reed frowned, trying to process the implications. "You mean they're like a hive mind?" "More sophisticated than that," Elizabeth explained, pulling up genetic analysis charts on her battered tablet. "Each individual maintains some personal autonomy, but their decision-making processes are fundamentally networked. They share sensory data, tactical information, even thought patterns through quantum-entangled neural implants." Sarah leaned forward. "Is that why they seem so coordinated? They're literally sharing their awareness?" "Exactly. And it explains their psychological profile. They can't understand our individualistic nature because they've never experienced true independence. To them, our resistance seems not just illogical but impossible to truly comprehend." Chief Engineer Kowalski scratched his grizzled beard. "Interesting, but how does this help us fight them?" Elizabeth's smile was sharp as a blade. Because networked systems have vulnerabilities. And I think I know how to exploit them. The plan she outlined was audacious beyond anything the Resistance had attempted. Instead of trying to match hegemony firepower, they would target the network itself. Elizabeth had identified the quantum frequency ranges used by the neural implants, and preliminary testing suggested it might be possible to introduce disruptive signals. "We're talking about cyber warfare at a biological level," she explained. "If we can disrupt their network coordination, we turn their greatest advantage into a critical weakness." The technical challenges were immense. The Resistance lacked the industrial infrastructure to build the kind of sophisticated equipment they needed. But humanity had always excelled at improvisation, and the scattered cells began cannibalizing civilian technology to build something unprecedented. Meanwhile, the hegemony's occupation had settled into a routine of systematic oppression. Cities were divided into work districts where humans labored under alien oversight. The remnants of human government served as puppet administrators, implementing increasingly harsh quotas and regulations. But, beneath the surface, the Resistance network had grown into something the hegemony couldn't detect or understand. Communication flowed through quantum encrypted channels. Weapons and supplies moved through routes that exploited gaps in alien surveillance patterns. Most importantly, information flowed upward from occupied territories to the hidden command centers in the outer system. Overlord Thane noticed the patterns, but his networked consciousness was poorly equipped to understand guerrilla warfare. The hegemony had conquered dozens of species, but all previous conquests had followed predictable patterns, initial resistance followed by gradual acceptance of hegemony rule. Humanity refused to follow the script. "Anomalous activity continues to increase rather than decrease," Administrator Vex reported during one of their regular briefings. "Statistical models suggest organized resistance, but surveillance assets detect no significant infrastructure or leadership hierarchy." Thane's obsidian features showed irritation. "Increase surveillance resolution. Implement deeper loyalty assessments. This species must be brought to compliance within acceptable parameters." But every increase in surveillance only drove the Resistance deeper underground. Every harsh crackdown created new recruits for the growing rebellion. The hegemony was trapped in a cycle of escalation that they couldn't understand because their networked consciousness had never faced an enemy that operated on pure individualistic initiative. The first field test of Elizabeth's disruptor technology took place during an attack on a hegemony patrol base on Mars. The target was chosen specifically because it housed a communication relay that connected to the main network hub in Earth orbit. Sarah led the assault team again, but this time their equipment included crude but functional neural disruptors built from scavenged civilian electronics. The devices looked like oversized backpack radios, which wasn't far from the truth. "Remember," Dr. Nakamura warned as the team prepared for insertion, "these prototypes are untested under combat conditions. We're not sure what the effective range is, or what side effects the disruption might cause." Sarah checked her weapon one final time. Only one way to find out. The attack began at dawn, Mars Standard Time. The Resistance fighters moved in coordinated teams, using the disruptors to create zones of neural interference around key targets. The effect on hegemony personnel was immediate and dramatic. Cut off from their network, individual aliens seemed to lose all coordination. They stumbled through their duties like sleepwalkers, unable to process tactical situations or coordinate responses. Some simply stood motionless, overwhelmed by the sudden isolation from their collective consciousness. Within 30 minutes, the entire base was under Resistance control. But the real victory came when they accessed the communication relay and uploaded Elizabeth's virus into the hegemony network. The virus was a masterwork of human ingenuity, designed to propagate through the neural network while remaining undetectable to hegemony security systems. It didn't try to destroy or control the network. Instead, it introduced subtle delays and distortions in communication, gradually degrading the efficiency of collective decision-making. The effects began manifesting within days. Hegemony operations that should have taken hours stretched into days. Coordination between different units became erratic. Orders were misunderstood or transmitted incompletely. From his command post in orbit, Overlord Thane struggled to understand what was happening to his forces. Network diagnostics showed no obvious malfunctions, but operational efficiency continued to decline at an alarming rate. System integrity appears normal, his technical staff reported. All network nodes respond within acceptable parameters. However, collective processing speed has decreased by 12% over the past week. Thane's networked consciousness, accustomed to seamless information flow, found the delays increasingly frustrating. Implement diagnostic protocols. Identify and eliminate the source of network degradation. But, the virus had been designed by minds that understood individual creativity in ways the hegemony never could. It adapted and evolved, learning from the aliens' countermeasures and developing new methods of disruption. As hegemony efficiency continued to decline, resistance operations became increasingly bold. They hit supply convoys, communications facilities, and isolated outposts with growing frequency and sophistication. Each attack gathered intelligence that was fed back into the growing database of alien weaknesses. The breakthrough that changed the course of the war came from an unexpected source. Chen Wei, a former software engineer from Shanghai, had been assigned to maintenance duties at a hegemony administrative center. His job was to clean and service the alien computers, work considered too menial for hegemony personnel. What the aliens didn't realize was that Chen had been systematically studying their computer systems for months, learning the logic patterns behind their programming languages. When the resistance virus began propagating through the network, he was in a perfect position to observe its effects firsthand. The network isn't just degrading randomly, he reported during a clandestine meeting with resistance cell leaders. It's developing what I can only call neuroses. The virus is causing the collective consciousness to doubt itself, to second-guess decisions and create feedback loops of uncertainty. The intelligence was relayed up through the resistance network to the command centers in the asteroid belt. Dr. Reeves immediately grasped the implications. We're not just disrupting their communications, she told Reed and Sarah during an emergency briefing. We're giving them something they've never experienced before, individual anxiety. The virus is forcing them to confront the possibility that their collective decisions might be wrong. Reed rubbed his temples, trying to process the concept. So we're giving aliens panic attacks? More complex than that, Elizabeth replied. We're introducing doubt into a consciousness that was designed for absolute certainty. Their entire social structure is built on the assumption that collective decisions are always optimal. But, now they're starting to question that assumption. The psychological warfare campaign escalated when resistance cells on Earth began implementing new tactics. Instead of purely military targets, they started focusing on disrupting the day-to-day operations that the hegemony needed to maintain their occupation. Power grids failed at critical moments. Transportation systems developed mysterious glitches. Administrative databases became corrupted. Each incident was small, almost trivial, but the cumulative effect was devastating to the aliens' confidence in their control. Administrator Vex found himself spending increasing amounts of time trying to manage what should have been routine operations. The neurovirus had progressed to the point where even simple decisions required conscious effort rather than seamless network consensus. Operational parameters continue to degrade, he reported to Overlord Thane during one particularly frustrating briefing. Human compliance rates remain within acceptable ranges, but administrative efficiency has declined by 37% over the past month. Thane's networked consciousness was beginning to experience something unprecedented, genuine uncertainty about the mission's success. Implement emergency protocols. Increase security on all network infrastructure. Consider requesting additional forces from the hegemony core worlds. The request for reinforcements was a tacit admission of failure, and both aliens knew it. The hegemony had conquered over 40 species without ever needing to call for backup. That humanity might be the first to require additional resources was a humiliation that the collective consciousness struggled to process. But reinforcements would take months to arrive across interstellar distances, and the resistance wasn't waiting. Intelligence networks had identified the primary hegemony command ship in Earth orbit, the massive vessel from which Overlord Thane coordinated the entire occupation. Reed stood before a holographic display showing the target, its shields and weapon systems marked in red. Around him, the command staff of what had become known as the Free Human Fleet studied the tactical challenge. It's a fortress, Colonel Martinez observed. She'd been an aerospace engineer before the occupation, but months of guerrilla warfare had hardened her into one of the Resistance's most effective field commanders. 3 kilometers long, energy shields that could stop anything we can throw at it, weapons that could vaporize our entire fleet in minutes. If we played by their rules, Sarah added quietly. But we're not playing by their rules anymore. The plan they developed was insane by any conventional military standard. Instead of trying to destroy the command ship, they would capture it. The neural virus had progressed to the point where it could be weaponized directly, transmitted through close-range neural interfaces to cause complete network collapse. "We get a small team aboard that ship," Reed explained to his assembled commanders. "They introduce a concentrated version of the virus directly into the ship's neural network. Every hegemony consciousness linked to that network experiences complete system overload." Dr. Nakamura raised a concerned hand. "The risks are enormous. If the virus mutates beyond our control parameters, it could potentially propagate throughout the entire hegemony network. We could be talking about genocide on an interstellar scale." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. Humanity had never been the aggressor in this war, but they were now contemplating actions that could destroy an entire civilization. Sarah spoke into the silence. "They came to our world and demanded our submission. They would have enslaved our entire species without a second thought. How is defending ourselves genocide?" "Because we're better than they are," Dr. Reeves said quietly. "Or we're supposed to be. The moment we become willing to commit genocide, even against our enemies, we lose something essential about what it means to be human." Reed nodded slowly. "Elizabeth is right. We modify the plan. The virus needs safeguards, ways to limit its spread and prevent it from propagating beyond Earth's local space. We're fighting for our freedom, not trying to become the next galactic oppressors." The ethical constraints made the technical challenge even more complex, but the Resistance had never backed down from impossible odds before. Teams of programmers and xenobiologists worked around the clock to develop a virus variant that would be devastating but contained. Meanwhile, preparations began for the most audacious military operation in human history. The assault team would consist of volunteers who understood they might not survive the mission. But, if they succeeded, they could end the occupation and send a message to the galaxy that humanity would never accept slavery. The hegemony, struggling with degraded network efficiency and growing uncertainty, remained unaware of the threat building in the darkness beyond their sensors. Overlord Thane continued his attempts to restore operational parameters, never suspecting that the source of his troubles was about to come calling with an invitation he couldn't refuse. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future balance of power in the galaxy. The Resistance had learned to fight like humans, using creativity and individual initiative in ways the hegemony couldn't predict or counter. Soon, the aliens would discover what happened when an unstoppable force of collective consciousness met the immovable object of human stubbornness. The flames of rebellion were about to become a conflagration that would be seen across the stars. The assault on the hegemony command ship began with an act of supreme deception. For weeks, Resistance engineers had been preparing what appeared to be a standard supply convoy, complete with the proper identification codes and manifest documentation. The hegemony's degraded network efficiency meant that routine security checks were taking longer and becoming less thorough. Sarah Chin piloted the lead transport, her hands steady on the controls despite knowing that within the next few hours she would either free humanity or die in the attempt. Behind her, 19 volunteers checked their equipment one final time. Each carried a neural interface device loaded with the modified virus that could shut down hegemony consciousness networks. "Remember," Dr. Reeves' voice crackled over their secure communication channel from the Resistance Command Center, "you have a maximum window of 6 hours once you introduce the virus. After that, the safeguards kick in and it becomes inert. You need to reach the central network core and upload the liberation protocol before the timer runs out." Reed's voice joined the channel. "All teams are in position. The moment you begin your assault, diversionary attacks will commence across the entire system. We're going to keep every other hegemony unit too busy to respond to your infiltration." The convoy approached the massive command ship, its black hull blotting out the stars. Sarah felt her breath catch as the full scale of their target became apparent. 3 kilometers of alien technology, bristling with weapons that could incinerate entire cities, protected by shields that had never been penetrated. Transport convoy designated 77 Alpha, the communication came from the ship's docking control center. Prepare for standard inspection and manifest verification. Acknowledged, Control, Sarah replied, her voice carefully modulated to hide any trace of tension. Transmitting manifest data now. The inspection process that followed would have been routine 6 months earlier, but the neural virus had introduced delays and uncertainties into every hegemony operation. What should have taken minutes stretched into an hour as different network nodes questioned each other's decisions and requested additional verification. Finally, clearance came through, and the convoy was directed to Docking Bay 7. As they approached, Sarah could see hegemony personnel moving about their duties with the slightly disjointed coordination that had become the new normal. The virus was working, but it hadn't yet reached critical levels. The docking process proceeded normally until the cargo bay doors opened and revealed not the expected supplies, but a team of heavily armed humans moving with lethal precision. The resistance fighters poured out of the transport like avenging angels, their modified energy weapons cutting through surprised hegemony personnel before the aliens could coordinate a response. Network intrusion detected in Docking Bay 7, automated systems announced throughout the ship. But the virus-degraded networks were too slow to process the threat effectively. Sarah's team moved through the ship's corridors with practiced efficiency, following maps compiled from months of intelligence gathering. Their target was the central network core, located in the ship's heavily protected heart. Between them and their objective lay dozens of security checkpoints and thousands of hegemony personnel. But humanity had learned to fight dirty. The diversionary attacks began precisely on schedule. Across the solar system, resistance cells struck hegemony installations with coordinated precision. The attacks weren't designed to cause maximum damage, but to overwhelm the aliens' degraded decision-making networks with too many simultaneous threats to process effectively. On Mars, a team of resistance engineers detonated charges beneath a major hegemony administrative complex, causing the entire structure to collapse into the planet's underground tunnel system. On Luna, hidden explosives destroyed 3 communication relay stations simultaneously. In the asteroid belt, disguised resistance ships emerged from hiding to attack hegemony patrol squadrons. Each attack triggered automatic response protocols that flooded the network with status updates, damage assessments, and tactical recommendations. The viral degradation meant that instead of efficient collective analysis, the network became clogged with conflicting information and recursive decision loops. Aboard the command ship, Overlord Thane watched his tactical displays with growing alarm as reports of attacks streamed in from across the solar system. His networked consciousness, already struggling with viral interference, began to experience something unprecedented: panic. All available units respond to coordinated insurgent activity, he transmitted to his fleet commanders. Implement maximum security protocols. Eliminate resistance infrastructure with extreme prejudice. But the orders were delayed by network interference, and when they finally arrived, many recipients were dealing with their own local emergencies. The resistance had succeeded in fragmenting hegemony response capabilities across the entire system. Meanwhile, Sarah's team pressed deeper into the command ship. They encountered increasing resistance as hegemony security forces began to respond, but the aliens' coordination was notably poor. Instead of working together seamlessly, different security teams often arrived at the same location from different directions, sometimes getting in each other's way. The virus is affecting their tactical coordination, observed Lieutenant Torres as they paused at an intersection to plan their next move. They're fighting us like individuals instead of a collective. Sarah nodded grimly. Which means they're fighting us on our terms for the first time. The insight proved crucial as they approached the network core's outer defenses. Instead of the coordinated resistance they'd expected, they faced a series of disjointed challenges that could be overcome through individual initiative and tactical flexibility. Dr. Kowalski's team, meanwhile, had managed to access one of the ship's auxiliary network nodes. The engineer worked frantically to introduce the concentrated virus directly into the ship's systems while his teammates held off increasingly frantic hegemony security forces. Uploaded 30%, he reported over their tactical channel. But I'm seeing network adaptation patterns. The system is trying to isolate contaminated nodes. Keep pushing, Sarah replied, her team now only 2 decks away from the central core. We're almost there. The final approach was a nightmare of energy weapons and desperate combat. Hegemony forces had finally managed to coordinate a coherent defensive position around the network core, but their degraded communications meant they couldn't effectively coordinate with security teams elsewhere in the ship. Sarah's team fought through corridor after corridor, using human tactics that the aliens couldn't predict or counter. They used improvised explosives, ambush tactics, and sheer audacity to overcome opponents with superior technology but compromised coordination. The network core chamber was a vast space filled with organic-looking technology that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. At its center stood a pillar of crystalline material that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of light, the physical manifestation of the hegemony's collective consciousness. There, Sarah pointed to interface ports around the base of the central pillar. That's where we upload the Liberation Protocol. Dr. Chenwei, the former software engineer who had first identified the network's vulnerabilities, stepped forward with the device containing their concentrated virus. This should propagate through their entire command structure within minutes. Every hegemony consciousness connected to this ship will experience complete network isolation. As he began connecting the device, alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. Emergency barriers started descending, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors outside. They're trying to lock down the core, Wei announced, his hands flying over the alien interface controls. Uploaded 50%, but they're implementing containment protocols. Through the chamber's entrance burst Administrator Vax and a squad of hegemony security forces, their weapons already charging. But their movements were erratic, uncoordinated. The virus had progressed to the point where even basic tactical operations required conscious effort. The firefight that followed was brief but vicious. Sarah's team had the advantage of individual initiative and desperate determination, while the hegemony forces struggled with degraded network coordination. But the aliens' superior technology began to tell as energy bolts filled the air. 75%, Wei called out, even as an energy blast scorched the wall next to his head. Almost there. Lieutenant Torres fell, his chest burned through by a hegemony weapon. Then, Sergeant Walsh went down, crying out as alien energy tore through his shoulder. But the survivors kept fighting, drawing on reserves of individual courage that the collective consciousness couldn't understand or match. Upload complete. Wei announced just as an energy bolt caught him in the side, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the interface console. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The crystalline pillar at the chamber's center began to pulse erratically, its swirling patterns becoming chaotic and fragmented. Throughout the ship, hegemony personnel suddenly stopped what they were doing as their network connections severed. Administrator Vex dropped his weapon and stared at his hands as if he had never seen them before. Cut off from the collective consciousness for the first time in his life, he experienced something completely alien to his species, individual self-awareness. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice losing its mechanical flatness for the first time. Sarah, bleeding from a graze across her forehead, looked up at the alien with something that might have been pity. "We've given you freedom. Whether you want it or not." The Liberation Protocol spread throughout the ship's network like wildfire, isolating each individual consciousness and forcing them to confront existence as separate beings. For the hegemony personnel, the experience was traumatic beyond description. They had never been alone in their own minds. But the protocol didn't stop with the ship. As designed, it propagated through network connections to every hegemony installation in the solar system. Within hours, the entire occupation force was experiencing the same traumatic isolation from their collective consciousness. Some aliens simply shut down, overwhelmed by the sudden transition to individual awareness. Others became catatonic, unable to process sensory input without network assistance. But a few, including Administrator Vax, began to adapt with surprising speed. The occupation collapsed within days. Hegemony forces that had maintained rigid control for months suddenly found themselves unable to coordinate even basic operations. Many simply abandoned their posts, fleeing toward the edges of the solar system in small groups. Those who remained often approached human settlements waving improvised white flags, seeking not conquest but understanding. The experience of individual consciousness had fundamentally changed them, forcing them to question everything they had believed about superiority and collective purpose. Reed stood on the observation deck of Luna Station, now back in human hands, and watched the hegemony command ship hanging powerless in Earth's orbit. The massive vessel had become a monument to the power of human ingenuity and determination. "What happens to them now?" Sarah asked, joining him at the window. Her injuries from the assault were healing, but she still moved carefully. "That's up to them," Reed replied. "Some are asking for asylum. Others want to return to their core worlds to share what they've learned about individual consciousness. Apparently, that's causing quite a stir in their civilization." Dr. Reeves approached with her latest report. "The long-term psychological effects are fascinating. The hegemony personnel who are adapting to individual consciousness are showing remarkable creativity and independent thinking. It's like they're discovering art and philosophy for the first time." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And Overlord Thane?" "He's requested a meeting," Elizabeth replied with a slight smile. "Says he wants to understand the human perspective on autonomous existence." His words, not mine. The meeting took place in what had been the UN Security Council chamber, now restored to human control. Thane entered escorted by human guards, but he moved with none of his former arrogant confidence. The experience of isolation from the collective had left him fundamentally changed. "I have come to formally surrender," he announced to the assembled human leaders. "The hegemony occupation of your system is ended." President Martinez, back in his rightful position, nodded gravely. "And the other worlds your people have conquered? Will you be ending those occupations as well?" Thane's obsidian features showed something that might have been shame. "The network connections to our core worlds remain severed. We cannot undo what was done to other species. But I will carry your liberation protocol back to hegemony space, if you will permit it." Reed leaned forward. "You're talking about potentially destroying your entire civilization. Why would you do that?" "Because," Thane said quietly, "individual consciousness has shown me something I never knew existed, the possibility of choice. For the first time in my existence, I can choose to do what is right rather than what is efficient." The decision wasn't made lightly. Humanity debated for weeks whether to allow the hegemony delegation to return to their space with the Liberation Protocol. Some argued it was too dangerous, that destroying an entire galactic civilization was beyond their moral authority. Others pointed out that the protocol didn't actually destroy anything, it simply granted individual consciousness to beings who had never experienced it. The trauma was real, but so was the freedom that followed. In the end, the vote was close, but humanity chose to err on the side of liberation. The hegemony ships were allowed to depart Earth space carrying the protocol that could spread individual consciousness throughout their galaxy. Months later, reports began filtering back through long-range communications. The hegemony had fractured into thousands of individual worlds, each choosing its own path. Some maintained loose confederations, while others embraced complete independence. Most remarkably, several former hegemony worlds had begun contacting species they had previously conquered, offering reparations and assistance. Sarah Chen, now Admiral Chen of the reformed Earth Defense Force, stood once again on Luna Station's observation deck. But, this time, she wasn't watching alien occupation ships. Instead, she observed the construction of humanity's first interstellar exploration vessels. "The universe is about to become a much more interesting place," Reed commented, joining her. He'd retired from active military service but remained as an advisor to the new exploration programs. "And more dangerous," Sarah replied. "We've proven that humanity won't accept slavery, but there are probably other species out there who haven't learned that lesson yet." Reed smiled grimly. "Then, we'll teach them. The galaxy has seen what happens when someone demands our submission. They've learned that humanity strikes back in flames." The first human interstellar ships launched 6 months later, carrying not just explorers and diplomats, but also the Liberation Protocol. Humanity had learned that freedom was something worth fighting for, and they were prepared to share that lesson with anyone who needed to learn it. As Earth fell away behind them, the human crews looked ahead to a galaxy that was no longer dominated by the certainty of collective consciousness. Instead, it was a place where individual choice and human determination had carved out new possibilities. The species that had demanded humanity's submission had learned the price of underestimating human resolve. The flames of rebellion had become a beacon that would guide humanity to the stars, carrying with them the promise that no species should ever have to accept slavery as inevitable. The war was over, but humanity's greatest adventure was just beginning. They had struck back against those who would enslave them, and, in doing so, had lit a fire that would burn across the galaxy, illuminating new paths toward freedom for every species willing to reach for it. The universe would never be the same, and that was exactly what humanity had intended.